If you were to sit in a quiet library tonight, with nothing but the hum of an old lamp above you, and take down a dusty atlas printed in the 17th or 18th century, you might find something that does not appear in your modern maps. There, among the curling lines of mountain ranges and rivers traced with careful ink, the word Tartaria spreads across a great swath of northern Asia. It seems to cover lands we now call Siberia, Mongolia, parts of Central Asia, even stretching toward China. And yet, in our present understanding of world geography, there is no such country. Tartaria exists in the pages of old books, in marginal notes of European explorers, in forgotten catalogues of trade, but it has no passport, no modern flag, no anthem. It lingers as a word, once familiar, now hushed. The maps of early modern Europe were always a curious balance between precision and imagination. Cartographers, those careful, quiet craftsmen of knowledge, relied on reports from sailors, merchants, missionaries, and sometimes rumors that traveled along the Silk Road. When confronted with vast expanses of land, beyond the reach of their own eyes or instruments, they sketched broad territories and gave them names that carried weight but lacked precision. In this way, Tartaria became not a nation in the modern sense, but a canvas. It was a space onto which the European mind projected both mystery and order. The word itself derives from Tatars, a name Europeans gave to various nomadic peoples of the steppe. Over time, the plural identity of tribes, confederations, and shifting khanates became flattened into a single term. The Tatars of Crimea, the Mongols of the Golden Horde, the horsemen of the Eurasian plains all were folded together beneath the single umbrella of Tartaria. And so, when a mapmaker had to shade the northern reaches of Asia, beyond Moscow and east of the Ural Mountains, the solution was simple. The great undefined region was marked Tartaria. For centuries, this designation gave a sense of closure. It provided a label where knowledge failed. It told the European reader, there is something here, though we cannot say exactly what. In the quiet logic of cartography, names served as placeholders of authority. To inscribe a word on parchment was to declare that a land had been noted, measured, acknowledged even if no detailed account existed of its people or geography. If you turn through maps of the 16th century, you see Tartaria drawn in multiple ways. Sometimes it appears divided. Great Tartary in the north, Little Tartary nearer the Black Sea, Chinese Tartary along the fringes of the Great Wall. In other works, it stretches unbroken, an empire of snow and silence. But in each depiction, it is large. Its sheer size on the page makes it feel important. And yet, when you search for its chronicles, its rulers, its capital cities, the details fall away like sand slipping through fingers. Part of the puzzle lies in how maps were made. A map was never simply a record of land. It was a statement of knowledge, often a political tool. To draw Tartaria large was to admit the limits of Europe's grasp, but also to emphasize the world's vastness. It was an acknowledgement of distance, of otherness. And so, a single name carried the burden of entire civilizations. When we read these maps now, in the quiet of the evening, it is easy to imagine that Tartaria was an empire hidden from modern memory, erased or concealed. The romantic notion arises that perhaps it was deliberately covered up, its history torn from archives, its monuments misattributed. But if we take the slow, measured pace of boring history, Another picture emerges. Tartaria may not have been a cover-up, but a simplification, a category invented by outsiders to make sense of what they did not know. Still, the word persisted with unusual strength. Long after the Tatars themselves had become distinct polities, long after the Mongol Empire fractured into smaller khanates, long after Russian expansion had brought Siberia under the Tsar, European maps continued to print Tartaria in white letters. This inertia is part of what makes the puzzle compelling. Why did the name remain when political reality had shifted? Why did cartographers, otherwise careful with new data, keep the ghost of Tartaria alive? Part of the answer lies in the rhythm of map-making itself. An atlas was expensive to produce. Engraved copper plates were not easily discarded. Names, once carved into metal, persisted through multiple editions. And so, the inertia of print culture meant that Tartaria lived on, repeated across decades. For a reader in London or Amsterdam, opening an atlas in the 1700s, the word conveyed authority. Few would have challenged it. But beyond the technical persistence of the term, there is something deeper. Tartaria, as a word, carried a certain poetry. It evoked the edge of the known world. It suggested horsemen sweeping across plains, frozen rivers, mountains too vast to cross. It evoked both danger and wonder. The name itself was useful not because it was precise, but because it filled the imagination. Imagine, then, a merchant in Paris looking at a map before setting out on a journey eastward. His finger drifts over Muscovy, then further across forests, and at last it stops at Great Tartary. The word tells him little, but it marks a destination beyond his reach. It is both a boundary and an invitation. In this sense, Tartaria became part of the mental geography of European anchor for the unknown, a word that absorbed uncertainty. To understand why this matters, one must consider what maps meant in daily life. Today, maps are functional, digital, precise, giving us directions to the nearest cafe. But in the early modern world, maps were furniture for the mind. They hung in study rooms, printed with elaborate borders, decorated with coats of arms, mythological figures, sea monsters. They were conversation pieces, symbols of learning. A map was less about navigation and more about demonstrating knowledge. And in this context, Tartaria was not a lie, nor a cover-up, but a performance of wisdom. It said, "Here is a land we have. Named, therefore it exists." Yet, for the modern reader, the persistence of Tartaria raises a haunting question. If this name, printed for centuries, could vanish so completely from our current lexicon, what does that say about the fragility of memory? If Tartaria could once dominate half a map, and now not even appear in a school atlas, what other names, what other regions, what other entire ways of describing the world have slipped away? It is here that the story of Tartaria shifts from mere geography to something more human. For behind every label lies a network of lives. Nomadic herders on the steppe, towns clustered along rivers, small khanates negotiating alliances, villagers trading furs, salt, and horses. These people did not call themselves Tartarians in the way European cartographers did. They had their own names, loyalties, traditions. The word Tartaria flattened them into a single silhouette, and when the word disappeared, so too did the recognition of those lives. at least in the European imagination. As you close your eyes tonight and picture those old maps, their yellowed pages, their curling ink, consider this: Tartaria was at once a vast presence and an absence. It was real in the minds of those who named it, and unreal in its lack of specificity. It was a label that grew too large, covering too much, and in the end, dissolving into nothing. And so the puzzle remains: why did Europe cling to this name for so long? Why did the word Tartaria survive centuries of cartographic refinement, only to vanish quietly in the 19th century as though it had never existed at all? If you were to leaf through the great atlases of Europe from the 17th through the early 19th centuries, the name Tartaria would greet you again and again. The Dutch atlas maker Joan Bleyu, whose monumental works were prized possessions of wealthy merchants, marked the northern sweep of Asia as Tartaria. Guillaume de Lisle of France, a cartographer celebrated for his precision, kept the name alive in his maps of the early 1700s, even as late as 1806, when Aaron Arrowsmith produced his map of Asia in London. Tartaria was still printed across Siberia. In some cases, it was subdivided: independent Tartary in Central Asia, Chinese Tartary near the Great Wall, Russian Tartary stretching deep into Siberia. The word lingered, adapting, fragmenting, but never disappearing altogether. The persistence of Tartaria in print reflected both habit and necessity. For European map makers, it was easier to continue using the familiar label than to constantly revise their plates with uncertain names from the East. The steppe world was in constant motion, tribes shifting alliances, conates rising and falling, borders fluid and hard to capture. To inscribe Tartaria across it all was not laziness, but a kind of shorthand. It told the reader, this land is known to exist, but it is not yet fully measured. But maps were only part of the story. Alongside atlases were the travel writings that gave life to distant lands. Missionaries of the Jesuit order, journeying into China, wrote long letters describing the peoples of Inner Asia. Merchants from Russia, moving furs and tea along caravan routes, reported encounters with nomadic groups. Englishmen like Anthony Jenkinson, travelling under the auspices of the Muscovy Company in the 16th century, returned with descriptions of Tartary that mingled observation with hearsay. And yet, despite these accounts, the name itself did not shrink. Instead of naming each polity distinctly, writers folded their experiences back into the broad category. A traveller might describe the Kyrgyz, or the Kalmyks, or the Oirets. Yet, when the narrative reached print in Europe, editors often simplified the matter. These were Tartars, inhabitants of Tartaria. The choice was not malicious, but it smoothed the narrative for audiences who would not recognize the complexity of steppe politics. To call it Tartaria was to make the strange legible dot at the same time. The endurance of the name carried a subtle political dimension. In Western Europe, maps were as much about rivalry as they were about science. The French, the Dutch, the English all produced atlases that competed for accuracy and prestige. But when it came to Tartaria, the vagueness itself was useful. Number. European power had firm control over those lands. To inscribe the name broadly was to claim a kind of neutrality, a cartographic shrug. It left the matter open, uncommitted dot. Meanwhile, in Russia, a different process was unfolding. As Muscovy expanded eastward in the 17th century, swallowing river by river, forest by forest, the Tsars acquired direct knowledge of Siberia. Cossacks marched to the Pacific, forts were built along the Lena and the Yenisei. To the Russians, these were no longer lands of Tartary but possessions of empire. Gradually, in Russian records, the word Tartaria gave way to more specific terms: Siberia, the Yakut lands, the Altai, the Amur. Yet in the West, where Russian documents filtered, slowly, the older name persisted. It was as though Europe's atlases were frozen a generation behind the actual frontier. By the late 18th century, this gap between reality and representation began to strain. Enlightenment geographers, devoted to precision, pushed against the loose categories of earlier times. They began to note the multiplicity of Central Asian Khanates: Bukhara, Hifa, Kokand. They described the Kazakh hordes, the Mongol banners, the Qing dynasty's control over Xinjiang. The word Tartaria grew increasingly awkward, to blunt a tool for the growing complexity of knowledge, and yet it lingered, because inertia is a powerful force in publishing. The 19th century marked the decisive turning point. This was the age of nation-states, of standardized boundaries, censuses, and bureaucracies. As modern states asserted their power, the cartographic imagination shifted. Where earlier maps tolerated vast swaths of ambiguity, modern maps demanded neat borders. The very concept of Tartaria no longer fit this new logic. A region without a central government, without treaties, without ambassadors, could not stand on a map designed for international politics. It had to be broken down, reclassified, absorbed into the frameworks of empire. Thus, Russian Tartary became simply Siberia, an integral part of the Tsar's dominion. Chinese Tartary became Inner Mongolia, Manchuria, and Xinjiang. Provinces under the Qing dynasty. Independent Tartary fragmented into the Khanates of Central Asia, soon to be drawn into Russian imperial conquest. The very same forces that created the modern world: railways, telegraphs, censuses, standing armies, zeroed the space for a word like Tartaria. For readers in Europe, the transition was gradual but noticeable. An atlas of 1800 might still show Tartaria in bold letters. By 1850, the name appears faintly, tucked in parentheses, almost apologetic. By 1900, it is gone altogether. What once covered half a continent has dissolved into the neat precision of modern geography. And so, the disappearance of Tartaria was not the result of a deliberate cover-up, but of a profound shift in how knowledge was organized. The Enlightenment prized categories, the nation-state demanded boundaries. Tartaria, too vague, too open, could not survive. Yet, the vanishing of the name carries a curious weight. It reminds us that the way we divide the world is never permanent. The names we use for places are not eternal truths, but conventions shaped by need. To call a land Tartaria was once perfectly ordinary. To call it that today is an oddity, a curiosity for enthusiasts of old maps. The shift illustrates how collective memory is not only what we remember, but what we forget. For those who dream in the quiet of history, Tartaria lingers as a ghost of another way of seeing. It is a reminder that geography is not just about mountains and rivers, but about imagination. It reveals how much of our mental picture of the world rests on fragile conventions, vulnerable to the turning of time. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not that Tartaria vanished, but how easily it did so. A word printed for centuries, taught 2 generations, could simply fade within a few decades, leaving little trace except in libraries. If such a vast concept can disappear, how many others have already slipped beyond recall? How much of the world, once confidently inscribed in ink, has dissolved into silence? If you turn the pages of atlases printed in the middle of the 19th century, you begin to notice a silence. Where once the word Tartaria sprawled across a continent, it now retreats into smaller spaces, tucked as a footnote, or sometimes left as a faded echo in parentheses, formerly known as Tartary. By the dawn of the 20th century, the word is gone altogether. Instead, you see names that feel familiar to us today: Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan, Xinjiang, Kazakhstan. The great, imprecise label that had satisfied mapmakers for centuries dissolves, as though it had never been there at all. This disappearance was not a dramatic event. There was no proclamation, no declaration that Tartaria should be erased. Rather, it happened in the quiet way that words often vanish through neglect, through disuse, through the steady tide of new conventions overtaking the old. Atlases reissued with updated plates no longer found a place for the term. School books taught children the names of provinces and nations, not vague regions. Scholars writing in the journals of geography and ethnography prided themselves on precision, and Tartary had become, to their eyes, a relic of imprecision. The shift is striking when one compares the margins of maps. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the decorative borders of atlases were filled with figures labeled Tartars, horsemen in fur caps, nomads leading camels, warriors with bows. They were stock images, less about ethnographic accuracy than about evoking distance. By the 19th century, such imagery had been replaced with railways, trade routes, shipping lines. The aesthetic of the unknown gave way to the aesthetic of industry. And with that change, Tartarian old word for an old way of thinking simply slipped away in this disappearance. We see something profound about the fragility of historical memory. For generations, Europeans spoke of Tartaria as if it were a stable fact. It appeared in sermons, in plays, in travelogues, even in children's stories. To refer to someone as a Tartar was to conjure an image of the distant, the foreign, the wild. Yet, within a few decades, the word had become antiquated, fit only for antiquarians, or for poets reaching into the vocabulary of the past. Memory, at both the personal and collective level, is always selective, just as an individual forgets details of their own childhood, so too societies forget the categories that once structured their world. When the political map of the 19th century demanded tidy borders and national identities, a word like Tartaria, imprecise and ambiguous, could not survive. It was not suppressed, it was abandoned. And abandonment can erase just as thoroughly as censorship. The case of Tartaria also illustrates how knowledge depends on repetition. A word exists as long as it is spoken, written, printed. Once the cycle of repetition is broken, silence sets in. A schoolchild of 1750 might have learned about Tartary as naturally as we learn about Asia today. A schoolchild of 1850 would have encountered it less often, perhaps only in passing. By 1900, the schoolchild would not have encountered it at all. Within 2 generations, the word had gone from common to obscure. For those who study history, this is a humbling reminder. We often assume that the categories we use are permanent, that the names on our maps today will last forever. Yet the story of Tartaria warns us otherwise. What we call permanent is, in truth, provisional. What we call knowledge is shaped not only by what we discover, but by what we choose to remember. There is, too, a certain melancholy in the vanishing of Tartaria. The name held a poetry, a sense of expansiveness. It suggested a world larger than the one we can see, a world of mystery and distance. Its erasure reflects not only a gain in precision, but also a loss of imagination. Modern maps, with their exact borders and coordinates, leave less room for the dream of the unknown. Tartaria belonged to a time when the edges of the world were not yet fixed, when the page of the atlas was still open to speculation, and yet, even as the name disappeared, traces of Tartaria linger in quiet corners. Old maps survive in archives. Antiquarian books preserve the word in their margins. Enthusiasts of forgotten histories, stumbling across the name, wonder why it no longer appears. In this sense, Tartaria has not entirely died. It has shifted from the ordinary vocabulary of geography into the realm of curiosity and mystery. It lives now as a question rather than an answer. When you think about this tonight, as you rest with the dim glow of history in your mind, consider the parallel to your own memory. Think of the words you once used daily that you no longer speak. Think of places in your life that once seemed central, but now barely remembered. History mirrors us in this way. What fades on the map also fades within ourselves. Perhaps the most haunting reflection is this: if Tartaria, once vast and unquestioned, can vanish so quietly, what else might be vanishing from our present world, unnoticed? What categories, what familiar names, will a future generation no longer understand? What concepts will they find puzzling in our books, the way we puzzle over Tartaria in old atlases? The fragility of memory is not a flaw, it is the nature of time. The maps we draw, whether of continents or of our own lives, are always temporary. They hold meaning while they are used, and then they yield to silence. In the end, Tartaria's disappearance teaches us that forgetting is as much a part of history as remembering. And so, as you picture those old atlases, once more the curling ink, the faded parchment, the vast letters spelling Tartaria, let the thought linger. The world you know is not fixed, but shifting. The names, the borders, the categories all are provisional. One day, they too will be replaced. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson Tartaria leaves us, that history is not only about what we preserve, but about what we inevitably let go. Imagine unfolding an old atlas on a wooden table, its leather binding creaking as though reluctant to reveal its contents. The pages, yellowed by age and softened by countless hands, still carry the faint smell of ink and dust. You run your fingers across the printed names of cities, rivers, and mountains, a whole world captured in careful lines and ornate lettering. But then something unsettles you, a name you do not recognize, printed boldly on the map. Perhaps it is a city placed on a riverbank, or a town nestled at the edge of a mountain chain. It seems important enough to deserve space on the map, yet when you search for it in modern atlases, it is nowhere to be found. This was not an uncommon experience in earlier centuries. Travelers, scholars, and even governments often remarked on the strange presence and sudden absence of places on maps. Some towns seemed to flourish on paper, appearing in atlas after atlas, only to vanish without explanation in later editions. Others were reduced to mere dots, their once proud names shrunk into obscurity before disappearing altogether. The effect was disorienting, as though the earth itself had shifted, erasing what had once been thought permanent. The fragility of cartographic memory is easy to forget in an age of satellite imagery and digital coordinates. We are accustomed to maps that align neatly with the landscapes we walk. But for most of history, maps were only approximations, works of imagination as much as measurement. Cartographers relied on reports from travelers, merchants, or soldiers, weaving fragments of knowledge into a larger whole. If a city was mentioned often enough, it was inscribed on the page. If it fell silent, neglected in the stream of information, it could fade from the cartographic record, almost as though it had never existed. Take, for example, the mysterious cities once drawn in the heart of Central Asia. On maps of the 17th and 18th centuries, one finds towns marked with elaborate lettering, surrounded by mountains and rivers carefully shaded with ink. These names spoke of caravan routes, of stopping points along the Silk Road, of places where merchants rested and exchanged their wares. Yet many of them no longer appear on modern maps. Some were destroyed by war or abandoned after the shifting of trade routes. Others may never have existed at all, their presence owed to rumors, exaggerations, or simple mistakes that gained the authority of print. For the mapmaker, the absence of confirmation did not matter. What mattered was filling the page, making the world appear whole to a reader of maps. The disappearance of a city could feel almost personal. Imagine a student in Paris or London, opening a newly published atlas and noticing that a town once carefully studied in geography lessons had vanished. Did the city fall? Was it destroyed? Or was it simply an illusion all along? The uncertainty lingered like a quiet mystery. For the average reader, with no means of travel or verification, the authority of the map was absolute. If a city was erased, then it ceased to exist, whether or not real walls and streets remained on the ground. This tension between permanence and erasure reveals something profound about maps. They were not mirrors of the world, but arguments about it. Every inclusion or omission was a decision shaped by politics, economics, or the limits of knowledge. A city that aligned with the concerns of empire, perhaps, a port valuable for trade, or a fortress critical for defense was marked prominently. A settlement of little use to the centers of power might be ignored, left to linger in obscurity until it disappeared altogether. In this way, the atlas was not simply a tool for navigation. It was a declaration of what mattered and what did not, of which places deserved recognition and which were to be forgotten. Even within Europe, where towns were tightly clustered and travel relatively easy, the record of maps is filled with vanished places. Some were lost to plague, emptied when disease struck with such force that survivors abandoned their homes. Others were victims of shifting rivers or advancing seas, their buildings swallowed by water. In such cases, the physical disappearance of the city coincided with its erasure from the page. But in other cases, the people remained, their settlement, alive, while the name quietly slipped from the atlas. Perhaps the town was renamed, or perhaps cartographers judged it too insignificant to include in newer editions. Either way, its disappearance on the page transformed it into a ghost of history. One of the strangest aspects of this phenomenon was its quietness. Cities did not vanish from maps with fanfare or announcement. They simply failed to appear one year, then were absent again the next. Readers, unless especially attentive, might not even notice. It was a kind of silent forgetting, a cartographic amnesia. Whole generations could grow up without ever learning that a once famous place had existed. Over time, only a few antiquarians and local inhabitants might remember. What does it mean, then, when a map no longer aligns with the world? For the traveler who sought a vanished city and found only fields or ruins, it meant confusion and disappointment. For the historian, it suggests that memory is fragile, that even something as apparently objective as geography is subject to erasure. And for us, looking back through old atlases, it reveals how precarious our sense of the past can be. As the candlelight flickers across the atlas spread before you, the names of half-forgotten cities shimmer like ghosts. Some belonged to thriving communities that were later destroyed. Others may never have existed, artifacts of error repeated until it seemed real. Still others lingered for centuries in maps before fading quietly away. The silence of their disappearance leaves us with questions that are difficult to answer. When a city is erased from a map, has it been lost from history itself? Or does it still live in memory, waiting to be rediscovered? The 19th century was an age of restless certainty, where earlier maps had embraced a kind of soft ambiguity traverse that meandered into uncharted spaces. Mountains shaded with imagination, towns marked on the strength of rumor. The modern age brought with it an ambition for precision. The compass, the chronometer, theodolites, and later even photography promised a cartography of exactitude. Every line could be measured, every coordinate fixed, every coast surveyed in detail. Yet, paradoxically, this pursuit of accuracy accelerated. The disappearance of cities from the maps of the world. Why? Because scientific cartography was not merely a neutral recording of landscapes. It was an act of definition, of narrowing the world to what fit within the concerns of empire, nation, and science itself. Earlier maps had erred on the side of inclusion, generously scattering towns across the page, acknowledging whispers and reports even if uncertain. Modern maps, by contrast, began to exclude as much as they included. If a place could not be verified by surveyors, it was struck from the atlas. If its presence did not serve a colonial project or a national boundary, it was quietly ignored. Accuracy was no longer about fullness, but about control. Consider the expansion of European empires in Africa and Asia. As surveyors moved across vast territories, their maps carried immense political weight. To mark a town was to recognize it. To omit it was to render it invisible. Many settlements that had once appeared on earlier, rumor-fed maps vanished under the scrutiny of modern surveys. Perhaps they existed, but in forms unrecognizable to European eyes: nomadic encampments, seasonal trading posts, or settlements without stone buildings. To imperial cartographers, such places often did not count as real cities. And so, in the new atlases of empire, they disappeared. Erased not because they had fallen, but because they did not conform to the definitions of those who now held the pen. Colonialism thus entwined itself with cartographic silence. The blank spaces of maps, those unsettling voids that seemed to call for conquest, were not empty lands but places deemed unworthy of inscription. Meanwhile, the settlements that were recorded often bore new names, imposed by governors and explorers. Old names, carried for centuries by local people, faded from the global record. The result was a double erasure, the disappearance of some places altogether, and the quiet renaming of others until their older identities were lost to memory in Europe itself. The rise of the modern nation-state exerted a similar pressure. Maps became instruments not only of geography but of political imagination. To unify a nation, it was necessary to standardize the record of towns, borders, and landscapes. Local variations, old names, or obscure villages mattered less than the clarity of the national whole. Small towns that had once graced regional maps began to vanish in newer editions, replaced by a focus on capitals, industrial centers, and cities of military importance. To appear on a national map was a sign of significance. To be omitted was to drift toward obscurity. This was not only a matter of politics, but also of culture. The 19th century was obsessed with progress, with the march of industry, railways, and urban growth. Cities that fit this narrative, ports bustling with trade, manufacturing towns with smoking chimneys, capitals crowned with monuments, were celebrated and inscribed boldly. By contrast, places that did not seem to belong to the story of progress were left behind. Rural towns shrank on the page, or disappeared entirely, their memory preserved only in older maps, tucked away in archives. The pace of erasure was further quickened by technology itself. With the advent of mass printing and standardized maps became more uniform than ever before. In earlier centuries, each cartographer might improvise, filling blank spaces with speculative towns or decorative flourishes. By the late 19th century, however, the atlas was a product of industrial consistency. A committee of editors decided what belonged and what did not, and the result was replicated in thousands of identical copies across the world. Once a city was removed, its absence was multiplied endlessly, leaving little room for alternative. Memories, even disasters, played their part. Fires, floods, and wars had always erased towns in the physical world. But now, their erasure was amplified by the authority of scientific mapping. When Lisbon was devastated by its great earthquake in 1755, it was rebuilt and reasserted on maps. But smaller towns, struck by similar fates, were often struck from the cartographic record entirely, their ruins deemed unworthy of continued recognition. It was as though the map demanded efficiency. Only places strong enough to persist in the New Age deserved to remain inscribed. There is a peculiar melancholy in looking at 19th century atlases and comparing them with those of the centuries before. The earlier maps, for all their errors and guesses, seem alive with possibility, dotted with towns that flicker like stars across unknown lands. The modern maps, by contrast, are tidier, more rational, but also more silent. They do not invite imagination, they enforce order, and in their silence they conceal a vast forgetting the hundreds of places, large and small, that slipped into invisibility. One might think of the people who lived in those disappearing cities. For them, life continued. Markets opened, children played in the streets, the rhythms of birth and death carried on. Yet, in the wider imagination of the world, they no longer existed. A merchant consulting an atlas might bypass their town. A historian writing from afar might never know it had been there. A child learning geography would never read its name aloud. The erasure of a city from the map did not mean its walls crumbled. Instantly, it meant that the world turned its eyes away. The irony is that modern cartography, in its hunger for accuracy, introduced new forms of distortion. The exclusion of unverified or politically inconvenient cities was itself a kind of falsehood, an illusion of precision that concealed human complexity. The scientific tools of measurement, rather than preserving every detail, often narrowed the record to fit the priorities of empire and nation. What vanished was not error, but memory, the lived presence of communities whose significance did not align with the lines of power. And so, the 19th century, with all its progress and knowledge, became one of the greatest ages of forgetting. It was the time when the maps grew more exact, but the world on the page grew smaller, stripped of the shadows and ambiguities that had once lingered there. In this silence, the disappeared cities remain, like ghosts, hidden between the lines, waiting for those who still search old atlases by candlelight to find their names and wonder at their absence. There is a stillness that falls when one contemplates the disappearance of cities from the page of history. It is not the stillness of ruins, where stone walls crumble and ivy climbs silently over the remnants of human ambition. Nor is it the silence of deserts or oceans, where absence itself seems natural. Rather, it is the quiet of erasure, the vanishing of names, the slipping away of presence into the folds of forgetfulness. To look upon an old atlas and see a town that no longer appears on the newer map is to experience a peculiar kind of ghostly encounter. One feels the brush of something that once existed and yet has been denied the dignity of continuity. The philosophical question that lingers is not only why these erasures occurred through empire, through standardization, through the narrowing gaze of modern science, but what it means that they did. What does it tell us about our way of remembering, and about the fragility of collective memory itself? At its heart, a map is a story. It pretends to be neutral, a simple reflection of geography, but in truth it is always an interpretation. It selects, it emphasizes, it omits. The places that appear upon its surface are not simply there because they exist in the physical world, but because someone, somewhere, decided they mattered enough to be written down. The disappearance of a city from the map, then, is not just a geographical adjustment. It is a shift in narrative, a reordering of importance, a recalibration of whose lives are worth recording. Here lies the unsettling truth. Progress, so often celebrated as the guardian of memory, has also been its most efficient eraser. The age of precision mapping, with its rulers and its grids, did not merely illuminate the world, it rearranged it. The vague inclusiveness of older maps allowed for multiplicity. The disciplined clarity of newer ones reduced the world to a narrower story. What was lost was not error, but imagination, not falsehood, but recognition. And yet, these vanishings carry a lesson about the nature of power. For it was power, more than ignorance, that determined what remained. The city that lay at a crossroad of imperial trade routes would endure in the atlas. The town that did not serve colonial administration would be excised. The village that aligned with a nation's boundary making was remembered. The one that complicated the border was ignored. Maps are not simply records, they are instruments. They do not merely tell us where we are, but shape what we are allowed to see. In this way, the erasure of cities reflects the larger truth that memory itself is political, always leaning toward the priorities of those who hold the pen. But there is also a deeper, more melancholic reflection. The vanishing of towns and names reveals how fragile our sense of continuity truly is. We imagine that history accumulates endlessly, that the past piles up behind us like layers of stone. But in reality, history can dissolve. The simple act of omission can send a place into obscurity, and once it has vanished from the common record, its recovery becomes a work of excavation. To recognize this is to feel a quiet humility, the awareness that much of human life, lived fully in its time, can vanish into silence unless tended to with care. Perhaps the most haunting element is that these disappearances were often unnoticed. When a city fades from the page of an atlas, the world rarely pauses to mourn it. There is no ceremony, no funeral for a forgotten name. The absence is almost imperceptible, like a star extinguishing in a night sky already filled with countless others. And yet, for those who once lived there, for those whose families walked its streets, that erasure is monumental. It is the difference between being remembered and being forgotten, between enduring in imagination and dissolving into silence. In this way, the vanishing of cities is a mirror to our own lives. Most of us will not be inscribed in bold letters upon the pages of history. We live in the spaces between, in the small towns and quiet corners that the great narratives of nations often overlook. And yet we matter to ourselves, to those we love, to the fabric of human experience. The erasure of cities reminds us that importance is not always measured by endurance in the record, but by presence in the moment. To be forgotten is not the same as not having existed. It is only to have slipped out of the stories that others choose to tell. There is also a paradox worth noting. In their absence, these forgotten cities sometimes achieve a kind of strange immortality. A curious scholar stumbles upon their name in an old atlas and begins to wonder, what was this place? Who lived there? Why did it vanish? In this act of wondering, the city is reborn as a mystery. Its silence becomes its voice, its disappearance becomes its trace. In this way, forgetting and remembering are not opposites, but entangled processes, each giving shape to the other. The fragility of historical memory, then, should not only sadden us, should awaken us to gentleness. To know that places, names, and even whole communities can be forgotten is to recognize the preciousness of what remains. It is to treat the records we do possess with reverence, and to understand that each name on a map is more than a mark of ink. It is a fragment of human life, a whisper of stories, a reminder of how much has been lived and how much has been lost. So when we trace with our finger across an old map and find a city that no longer appears in the newer editions, we are not simply observing a cartographic change. We are encountering the delicate edges of memory itself. We are feeling the weight of silence, the presence of absence, the reminder that history is not fixed but fragile, always vulnerable to the currents of power, progress, and neglect. And in that moment, perhaps, we can choose to remember not perfectly, not fully, but tenderly the countless lives and places that once flickered across the page of the world and now remain only as shadows in forgotten ink. The 19th century was a century of rearranging stories. It was an age in which empires stretched their reach across oceans, in which the language of science grew increasingly confident, and in which maps the quiet arbiters of memory were redrawn with a precision that left less and less space for ambiguity. Within this unfolding age of order and classification, Tartaria, that once vast and vaguely outlined expanse that had stretched across the imagination of Europe for centuries, began to fade. Its decline was not the sudden collapse of a known kingdom, not the fiery fall of a capital city or the defeat of an emperor on the battlefield. Rather, it was a quiet erasure, a steady retreat into silence, so gradual that many never noticed it happening. To open a European atlas from the early part of the century is to glimpse a world still filled with shadows and uncertainties. Across the great plains and steppes of Asia, west of Siberia and east of the Caspian, names appear that blur categories. Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary. They suggest spaces beyond easy comprehension, regions too vast to reduce to precise borders. These were not the marks of ignorance alone, but of a worldview that allowed for expansiveness, for the possibility that the world was not yet fully explained, that mystery could still hold a place upon the page. But by the middle of the century, as surveying instruments grew sharper and the imperial ambitions of Russia, Britain, and China carved more defined territories into the steppe, those shadows began to shrink. The cartographer's pen, once willing to sketch sweeping labels across enormous regions, grew more restrained. Where once there had been Tartaria, there was now Turkestan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, or Siberia. The great umbrella term, which had served as a catch-all for lands European eyes did not yet understand, no longer fit the scientific mood of the age. Vagueness became unacceptable. Precision was demanded. Yet this transformation was not merely a matter of geography. It reflected a deeper change in how Europe imagined the world. Tartaria, for centuries, had functioned as a space of otherness, a zone that gathered together all that was distant, nomadic, and unfamiliar. It was a place of stories, the wandering horsemen of the steppe, the formidable Mongol Empire that had once shaken Europe with its campaigns, the whisper of silk roads and caravans that crossed endless horizons. To speak of Tartary was not to describe a nation, but to evoke a mood, vast, unsettled, open. As the 19th century advanced, that mood no longer aligned with the self-image of modernity. Europe preferred sharper lines, firmer borders, the solidity of nation-states. The world was to be categorized and classified in the manner of the natural sciences, just as botanists arrange plants into careful taxonomies and geologists identified strata with meticulous detail. So too did geographers seek to reduce the world into clearly defined entities. A name as diffuse as Tartaria, with its lack of clear boundaries, came to be seen not as a useful designation, but as an embarrassment, a relic of imprecision. The Russian Empire, expanding with relentless ambition into Central Asia, played no small role in this transformation. To Moscow, Tartaria was not a neutral designation. It was a name that suggested vagueness and foreignness, even in lands they sought to claim as their own. For Russia, it was preferable that the steppe be called Kazakhstan, that Turkestan be drawn into imperial borders, that Mongolia be distinguished in political terms. The very project of empire required the breaking down of vagueness into manageable provinces. The fading of Tartaria, then, was not only a European scholarly decision, it was an imperial strategy, a way of absorbing space into a system that could be governed. Meanwhile, Western Europe's atlases followed suit, though for slightly different reasons. Two British geographers, Tartaria was less useful than distinctions like Russian, Asia, or Chinese Empire. Two French scholars, the term carried echoes of medieval maps, of Marco Polo's accounts, of an older world that no longer matched the ambitions of modern cartography. As global exhibitions displayed ethnographic collections, as museums classified artifacts, the taste for generalization waned. Specificity was equated with progress, vagueness with backwardness, yet one cannot help but feel that something intangible was lost in this transition. To erase Tartaria from the maps was not merely to correct an error, it was to silence a word that carried centuries of association. It was to close off a realm of imagination, to declare that the world could now be fully named and divided. In the candlelit quiet of a study, one might turn the pages of an older atlas and feel the absence keenly. The word Tartaria had once been a vast canvas, an invitation to think of distances and peoples beyond comprehension. Its disappearance reflected not only an advance in knowledge, but a narrowing of vision. The 19th century was filled with such acts of narrowing. Where once the world had been filled with blank spaces that invited speculation, now it became filled with data. Railroads, telegraphs, and military campaigns all demanded accuracy. The unknown was not to be cherished, but conquered, measured, and catalogued. In such a climate, Tartaria's survival was impossible. Its vagueness condemned it, and so, without protest, it slipped quietly from the record. And yet, even in its fading, the name lingered in certain corners, the lips of travelers who preferred the old language, in the notes of scholars still, tracing the shadow of Marco Polo in the quiet margins of maps where the old terminology had not yet been erased. It was as though Tartaria, though dying, refused to vanish all at once. The 19th century was its twilighter century in which the word still appeared, ghost-like, beside more modern names, a reminder that memory does not disappear with a single stroke of the pen, but fades gradually, like a candle burning to its end. Thus, the story of Tartaria in the 19th century is a story of transition, from empire to silence. It is the moment when an old word, heavy with centuries of meaning, gave way to the sharpness of modern classification. It is the moment when the map, once a canvas for mystery, became an instrument of authority. And it is the moment when Europe, in its pursuit of order, began to silence one of its oldest shadows. If Tartaria disappeared from the maps in the 19th century with the slow precision of the surveyor's pen, it disappeared from culture with a different rhythm, less technical, more theatrical, for maps and atlases were not the only places where the story of the world was told. It was also told in newspapers, in magazines, in the great industrial exhibitions where nations put themselves on display, and in the curiosities that filled museums and traveling shows. These were the stages on which the imagination of the public was shaped, and in these stages Tartaria began its final bow. The 19th century loved exhibitions. They were vast theatres of progress, designed to assure the public that the world was knowable, controllable, and increasingly organized under the banners of empire and science. The Great Exhibition in London of 1851 set the tone. Housed in the glittering glass palace of the Crystal Palace, It was a festival of modernity, a showcase of machines, textiles, minerals, and the trophies of global exploration. Here, entire continents were laid out in ordered displays: Egyptian antiquities, Indian fabrics, Chinese porcelains, American inventions. The whole world was present, but it was a world refracted through imperial categories, arranged for the gaze of the visitor. And yet, among the vast displays, one does not find Tartaria. By 1851, the word was already receding into obscurity, replaced with more specific names. What appeared instead were sections labeled Central Asia, Siberia, Mongolia. Russia, eager to cement its authority, contributed exhibits under its own imperial name, displaying furs, minerals, and crafts from the steppe, all carefully framed as part of Russian territory. What might once have been lumped together as curiosities were now presented as Russian or Chinese artifacts. The old word had no place in the new taxonomy of progress. Newspapers, too, played their part in this cultural shift. In earlier centuries, the word Tartary had appeared frequently in European reports, often used to describe distant wars, nomadic raids, or unusual customs from the East. But by the 19th century, such reports began to use more precise designations. The Tartar tribes of the steppes were increasingly referred to as Kazakhs, Uzbeks, or Mongols, each folded into a narrower ethnic or geographic identity. When Russia annexed Central Asian Khanates, newspapers described them not as victories in Tartary, but as the conquest of Khiva, Bukhara, or Sap. The old word was left behind, too imprecise for a world now dominated by diplomatic treaties, railway surveys, and telegraph reports. Popular culture followed the same path. In the 18th century, one could still find plays in operas with Tartars as characters, sometimes imagined as noble horsemen, sometimes as fearsome invaders, always painted with a brush of exoticism. By the 19th century, however, these theatrical Tartars had faded from the stage. Exotic characters remained. Of course, the Orient was still a fascination, with Turkish sultans, Persian shahs, and Chinese mandarins appearing in novels. An operas, but the vague figure of the Tartar no longer carried the same resonance. The public imagination preferred sharper identities. It was not Tartars, but Mongols or Tatars or Cossacks who filled the novels and serialized tales of the century. In the realm of travel writing, the pattern was the same. Earlier centuries had produced accounts of travelers like Marco Polo or Jesuit missionaries who spoke of Tartary as a great and vaguely bounded land. By the 19th century, explorers' accounts grew more meticulous. British officers mapped passes through the Himalayas and described encounters with tribes in Afghanistan and Turkestan. French travelers wrote of the bazaars of Saint or the ruins of Khiva. German scholars catalogued the languages of Central Asia with philological precision. These works, printed in journals and serialized for the curious public, rarely invoked the grand, sweeping label of Tartaria. To use the word would have seemed old-fashioned, unscientific. Museums, to reflect the silence. Walk into a European natural history museum of the early 19th century, and you may find cases filled with artifacts labeled with broad regional terms: Tartar weapons, Tartar saddles, Tartar costumes. But as the century progressed, such labels gave way to narrower ones: Kyrgyz saddle, Uzbek knife, Mongol bow. The logic of classification, the same logic that gave Latin names to every plant and insect, did not tolerate such generalities. In the bright halls of these institutions, Tartaria ceased to exist, not because its artifacts were gone, but because its name had become unacceptable. Even children's literature played a quiet role. Fairy tales and storybooks in the 18th century might speak of the Tartars as distant riders who lived at the edge of the known world. By the late 19th century, those riders were replaced with more specific figures: Turks, Persians, Mongols, or with purely fictional lands of fantasy. The vague geography of old had no place in a culture increasingly obsessed with precision and realism, even in its fiction. The cumulative effect of these shifts was a quiet but thorough disappearance. Tartaria did not vanish all at once. There was no announcement, no declaration that the word was obsolete. Instead, it faded gently, as if by cultural agreement. Each mapmaker, each journalist, each exhibition curator chose slightly more precise terms, and the old name was left unspoken. Slowly, it ceased to belong to the living vocabulary of Europe. And yet, for all this silence, echoes remained. In certain corners of literature, one still finds the old word used nostalgically. Perhaps, or with a sense of romantic distance, a poet might invoke Tartary as a symbol of the faraway, the unknowable. A writer of fantasy might use it to conjure an imaginary past. But these were exceptions, faint voices against the overwhelming tide of precision. Tartaria, in the 19th century, had become a ghost, not wholly gone, but no longer part of the ordinary language by which the world was described. This cultural silence tells us much about the age. The 19th century was not simply an era of discovery, it was also an era of forgetting. To remember one set of names was to erase another. To classify the world anew was to declare that the old categories no longer belonged. And so, while exhibitions dazzled with their glass and iron palaces, while newspapers chronicled imperial conquests in meticulous detail, an older imagination slipped quietly away. Tartaria, once a word that evoked vastness and mystery, was replaced with names that fit the new order. The silence was not a conspiracy, but it was deliberate, the result of countless choices made in the service of progress. Thus, in the exhibitions, newspapers, and popular culture of the 19th century, we can trace the final cultural retreat of Tartaria, not with fanfare, not with spectacle, but with quiet omission. It was a disappearance made not by erasure, but by substitution. Unlike all such disappearances, it left behind an absence that was only noticed once it was too late to recover the word in its old fullness. There is something haunting in the way a word can vanish. Tartaria, once printed on maps with bold strokes, once whispered in travelers' tales and spoken aloud in the great salons of Europe, became little more than an echo by the end of the 19th century. The disappearance was not violent, nor even particularly dramatic. It was quiet, as if the word itself had grown tired and allowed itself to sink into the depths of silence. Yet within that silence lies a story that is larger than Tartaria alone. It is a story about memory, about power, and about the strange fragility of the categories by which we describe the world. To lose a word is not the same as losing a place. The steppes of Central Asia still stretched into the horizon. Rivers still cut through the plains, and mountain chains still caught the light of the morning sun. Peoples still lived, their herders, farmers, raiders, merchants just as they always had. And yet, by losing the word Tartaria, Europe lost a certain way of seeing. The landscape no longer belonged to the vast, undifferentiated expanse of mystery that the word once signified. Instead, it was broken into smaller, sharper, more manageable parts. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Siberia. Each name was tidier, each designation more precise. But in the process, something was also diminished. The haze of mystery, the sense of immensity, the feeling of being confronted by an ungraspable horizon. All of this slipped away with the old word. This is the paradox of progress. The 19th century prided itself on clarity, on its ability to replace vagueness with definition, where earlier centuries had been content with blurred outlines. The New Age insisted on boundaries, on surveys, on classification. Progress promised mastery of knowledge, yet mastery often comes at the cost of wonder. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps and culture was not just a linguistic shift, it was a shift in imagination. A continent once filled with mystery became a grid of named territories. The unknown was no longer permitted to exist. To reflect on this is to realize how fragile memory can be. We often think of memory as something durable, something that lingers naturally so long as the events themselves have occurred. But collective memory is shaped less by what happened than by what is allowed to be said. Tartaria did not vanish because the land disappeared, but because no one was left to keep the name alive. When exhibitions chose to relabel artifacts, when newspapers preferred more precise designations, when travelers sought scientific accuracy, they were not simply describing reality, they were shaping which realities were remembered. Silence is not just the absence of sound. It is the result of choices, of countless acts of omission. It is tempting to think of this disappearance as a kind of cover-up, as if a deliberate hand erased Tartaria from the page. Yet perhaps it is more subtle than that. The erasure was not conspiratorial, but systemic. It grew out of the values of the age: precision, order, progress. Each individual choice by a map maker, by a journalist, by a curator seemed minor, even necessary. But together, those choices created a silence as deep as if it had been planned. In this way, the fading of Tartaria tells us something unsettling about history, that forgetting does not always require malice. It can happen through the ordinary workings of progress itself. There is also a philosophical lesson in how easily words, once thought permanent, dissolve. The solidity of our categories is an illusion. We take comfort in names, in the thought that they anchor reality. But names are like shadows. They shift with the angle of the light. The word Tartaria endured for centuries, shaping European imagination of the East, and then, almost without resistance, it fell silent. If a word that once defined half the world could vanish, what does that say of the words we rely on today? Which of our categories, so carefully drawn, will future generations regard as quaint relics, as vagi, as Tartaria? The silence of Tartaria also reveals the close link between memory and power. To name a place is to claim authority over it. To rename a place is to reshape how it is understood. When Russia insisted on Siberia, when Britain spoke of Afghanistan, when France described Turkestan, these were not merely acts of accuracy. They were assertions of control. A place is not only conquered by armies, but by words. To erase Tartaria was to strip away an old, ambiguous identity and to replace it with categories that served the needs of empire. What is remembered and what is forgotten are always bound to power. And yet, for all its disappearance, Tartaria lingers like a ghost at the edge of memory. The word is no longer part of ordinary speech, yet when one encounters it in an old atlas or a faded traveler's account, it awakens something in echo of the vastness it once represented. It reminds us that history is not a straight line of progress, but a patchwork of remembering and forgetting. Behind every silence, there lies a story of choices made, of visions of the world embraced or abandoned in the end. The fading of Tartaria in the 19th century is not only a story about a vanished word, it is a mirror held up to the fragility of our historical imagination. We see in it how easily categories can shift, how quickly a world can be reclassified, how thoroughly silence can be produced without anyone intending harm. To reflect on Tartaria is to reflect on the tenuousness of memory itself. Perhaps this is why the story lingers with a peculiar melancholy. For, in its silence, Tartaria becomes a symbol not only of the lands once labelled with its name, but of all the histories that vanish quietly without notice as progress marches on. The 19th century prided itself on order, but in achieving that order it left behind a trail of forgotten words, forgotten identities, forgotten ways of seeing. Tartaria is one of those forgotten names, and in remembering it, even briefly, we remember how much is always at risk of being lost. And so we close this reflection not with a conclusion, but with a question. How many other Tartarias lie hidden beneath our current maps, our current words, waiting for the silence to close over them? There is a stillness that comes when we speak of lost worlds. It is not the stillness of absence alone, but of recognition, the recognition that what has faded once had a place, and that its silence is not accidental. Tartaria, as we have traced, through maps, through exhibitions, through words and erasures, now rests in the realm of forgotten histories. But to linger with its story is to realize that the silence around it has something to teach us, not just about the 19th century or the march of empires, but about ourselves, about the fragility of memory, and about the responsibilities we carry in how we remember. The first lesson Tartaria leaves us with is that history is not fixed. We are often taught to think of the past as a solid thing, a chain of events laid out in unchangeable sequence. But Tartaria reminds us that history is shaped by perspective, by naming, by what is recorded and what is allowed to fade. The vast expanse of Central Asia did not vanish, yet the word that once described it did. In that disappearance, we glimpse how malleable history can be. It is not the events alone that matter, but the words, the categories, the narratives that surround them. To remember this is to resist the illusion that the histories we hold today are permanent. They, too, will shift. They, too, are fragile. The second lesson is about power. To name is to hold authority. To erase is to command silence. When Tartaria dissolved into Siberia, Turkestan, Mongolia, and other categories preferred by empires, it was not a neutral act of scientific refinement. It was a redrawing of imagination to suit the needs of states. History is never only about what happened. It is about who had the authority to decide how it would be remembered. And when we notice what has been erased, when we notice the silences, are reminded to ask whose voices were excluded, whose ways of seeing were suppressed, whose memory was deemed unnecessary for the future. Tartaria is just one example, but there are countless others. The third lesson lies in humility. The disappearance of Tartaria is a reminder that our own categories, however stable they seem, will one day appear fragile and temporary, just as past generations once trusted in the solidity of Tartaria, only to see it melt away. So too will many of our present assumptions be reclassified, forgotten, or replaced. What seems permanent is rarely so. This is not cause for despair, but for gentleness, gentleness toward the past, knowing it was trying to make sense of its own uncertainties. Gentleness toward ourselves, realizing that the future will look back and find our own categories equally fragile. In this humility lies a kind of peace. The fourth lesson is about the value of wonder. The age that erased Tartaria prized precision, measurement, and control. Yet in erasing the vagueness of Tartaria, it also erased the sense of vastness and mystery the word once carried. To sit with the memory of Tartaria is to remember that not everything needs to be fully defined, that sometimes the unknown holds its own kind of wisdom. Progress brings clarity, but clarity can come at the cost of imagination. Forgotten histories remind us to leave room for wonder, to allow some spaces in our maps, whether of the world or of our lives, to remain open, unresolved, unbounded. Finally, Tartaria teaches us about silence itself. We tend to think of silence as emptiness, as nothingness. But silence is often shaped, created, cultivated. The fading of Tartaria into obscurity was not the silence of neglect, but the silence produced by countless decisions of cartographers, curators, scholars, empires. To notice such silences is to realize that forgetting is never neutral. It is an act, whether intentional or not. And if forgetting is an act, then remembering can also be an act, one of quiet resistance, one of care, one of honoring what might otherwise be lost. So what do we do with Tartaria now? This forgotten name that lingers only faintly in old maps and in the margins of memory. Perhaps we do not need to revive it, nor to imagine conspiracies in its fading, but instead to use it as a lantern that casts a soft glow on the processes of forgetting and remembering, helping us see more clearly the fragility of what we know. To whisper Tartaria is to remind ourselves that history is never complete, that silence is never empty, that what is forgotten still has lessons to teach. And so, as this reflection draws to a close, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a threshold. Tartaria is gone, yet in its very absence it leaves us with a gift, the awareness that all histories are partial, all memories fragile, and that within the silences of the past lie echoes waiting to be heard. To listen for them is to practice a gentler kind of history, one that honors what has been lost, one that accepts the impermanence of names, and one that moves forward not with certainty, but with humility, with care, and with wonder. Let us, then, allow Tartaria to rest in its silence, but not without remembrance. For in remembering it, even softly, we remember the greater truth it points to, that history is not simply what is written, but also what is forgotten, and that within that forgetting lies the most fragile, and perhaps the most human, part of our past.